Order. Anna Sabine to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered financial inclusion in rural areas. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Mr Pritchard. I'm also grateful to the Chairman of Ways and Means to have been granted a debate on financial inclusion in rural areas. Financial inclusion is the ability of people to access, understand and use financial services to manage their money and reduce poverty. I hope the Minister will agree with me that we need better financial inclusion across the UK, and I've been heartened to see the new government talk about financial inclusion. But more rural areas face a whole host of issues which make the challenges around financial inclusion even greater, and that is what I hope to focus on today. My constituency of Frome and East Somerset is predominantly rural area, with a number of market towns such as Frome, Midsummer Norton and Radstock, and 150 villages and hamlets. Frome has recently been allocated a banking hub after our last bank branch announced it would close. And while thankfully Midsummer Norton still has 2 bank branches open, these serve surrounding areas as far as the nearby city of Bath, meaning residents in the surrounding villages are still travelling miles to reach their nearest bank. Access to cash and face-to-face banking is vital for around 5 million customers across the UK who may be vulnerable due to low income or age. And in rural areas, many people are dependent on cash for their livelihoods. When bank branches close, which is already more likely in rural areas, residents are increasingly vulnerable because the alternatives are more physically spread out, and after losing free-to-use cash points, rural residents have to travel 3 times as far to get cash as those in urban areas.
On that note, will my honourable friend give
yes, I will.
Thank you for giving way. I'd like to thank her for giving way and securing this debate. Large banks are leaving our high streets at an alarming rate. Ustergunlais, the biggest town in Brecon, Radnor and Cwmtawi, has been denied a request for a banking hub. This is despite the billions of pounds of profit that Lloyds Bank made in 2023. Does the honourable member agree with me that communities like Ustergunlais, which is has some of the most deprived areas in Wales, should be at the forefront of moves to expand banking hubs across the UK, and that the big banks should treat their customers well and deliver their fair share of services for local residents?
Member to know that I do agree, and I actually come on to talk about the criteria that Link used in allocating banking hubs further on in my speech. In Frome and East Somerset, an average of £630,000 is withdrawn in cash each month, showing how vital this is for people in these areas. There are 2 main groups most affected by lack of access to cash: deprived groups and the elderly. For people on low incomes, cash can act as an effective method to budget efficiently. For the elderly, many feel excluded by the increasing reliance on digital services. With BT set to swap from analogue to digital landlines for millions of customers across the UK, there are concerns this will lead to more isolation for the elderly, who rely on landlines for their access to the outside world. And in many rural areas, they may not have good broadband or mobile signal either. Yeah.
Can I commend the Honourable Lady for bringing that forward? Unfortunately, in my constituency of Strangford, I think it's 11 banks that I've closed, so the impact upon the rural dwellers is very, very real. But does the Honourable Lady share my concern that if you don't have a bank or a face of someone to talk to, what you end up doing, you can look towards unregulated money lending and not receiving the appropriate financial advice that you should need. And with that being the case, then the banks, with their massive profits that they have, mean that the ordinary person is suffering even more.
I totally agree with the honourable member, and I hadn't actually considered that in my speech, and I'll take that away as a point to note for the unregulated money lending. Since the Financial Conduct Authority changed its regulations, Link has been able to do some valuable work providing cash access to local areas. However, I would urge the government to look at how they make the regulations for Link more flexible, to allow them to work on a case-by-case basis, as the current criteria doesn't take into account certain geographical and other barriers which affect rural areas. For example, we know that 93% of people live within 1 mile of an ATM, which on paper sounds good, but it doesn't take into account issues that might come up in rural areas. For example, if you live in a village or a hamlet, that 1 mile walk might have no safe walking routes and no bus connection, which is why we want to see the legislation expanded to include specific geographical, physical and societal barriers come into consideration. Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Mr Pritchard. The Honourable Lady is making an excellent speech about both the accessibility of banks and other financial services and the challenges faced by residents in rural areas. In my constituency in Reading Central, we face similar challenges with the large village of Caversham, which is part of Reading now, where many residents struggle because they have to go into Reading town centre, which, whilst it's pedestrianised, can be quite an intimidating journey if you're disabled involves a bus journey if you perhaps have limited mobility. Would you agree with me that there's a very valid point about the location of banking services in terms of how close they are to parking, to residents' homes, and very short journeys are much, much better for disabled and vulnerable residents?
Yeah, I totally agree with the honourable member, and actually this is exactly the point we're trying to make, that Link, who I believe want this kind of flexibility to make more subtle judgments rather than be working against a very flat kind of assessment structure. With the closure of bank branches, banking hubs are becoming a lifeline for many towns, reinvigorating high streets and increasing footfall even. They probably increase football as well. I know Frome residents are excited to have their banking hub open soon.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Yeah, I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr. Chair. On the point, would my honourable friend agree that banking hubs are key for financial inclusion? Does she also share my concern that the government's plan to build 350 banking hubs over 5 years across the entire country is not enough to help ensure proper access to in-person banking and cash services in rural communities? Does she also share my frustration that the town of Ilminster in my constituency has just been denied a banking hub by Link's reassessment, and will she join me in calling for Link to reconsider its decision?
I'm very sorry to hear from my honourable friend about what's happening in Ilminster. That sounds very frustrating. I'm just going to come on and talk a little bit more about banking hubs now and why I think they're a good thing, and we do need more of them. Prosper Frome, an organisation in my constituency that focuses on improving financial accessibility, has been advocating for a banking hub for over a year before it was announced by Link and Cash Access UK in September. This was a great relief to residents who were about to see their final bank close. But Jean and Sam at Prosper Frome believe the scope for banking hubs is too narrow, and they've been lobbying hard to get a banking hub included as part of a much wider community project, enabling the hub to be multi-purpose. Making banking hubs more diverse widens their appeal and can make banking and financial inclusion the anchor of the kinds of community third spaces that many towns are currently lacking.
Will she give way?
Yeah, I will.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I congratulate her on securing this really important debate. She's very right to say that banking hubs are more than just access to cash. In the market towns of North Norfolk, our small businesses need access to banking services, which full bank hubs can provide. Does she therefore understand why residents of North Walsham are so frustrated that the outcome of their recent cash review was simply to give them a cash and deposit machine located in the local fried chicken shop?
That does sound very frustrating. Sorry to hear that from my honourable friends. And yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit as well about the importance of face-to-face contact when banking. Shutting branches and opening banking hubs is currently financially efficient for banks, but there's a real risk that these banking hubs could close after a few years once the banks stop saving money and see these hubs as a drain on their profits instead of a benefit. We need reassurance about the long-term provision of banking hubs and a requirement on banks to keep funding them on an ongoing basis.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Yes, go for it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pritchard. I'd like to thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate her on securing this very important debate. In Wokingham, our application for a banking hub was declined, despite the very hard work of one of my constituents, Lynn Forbes. The work of Link within the current legislation can help encourage the protection of face-to-face banking. However, they aren't explicitly empowered to take that into account. Therefore, it is not considered in their final decision-making process for a banking hub. Does my honourable friend agree that the government needs to put forward further legislation requiring the protection of face-to-face banking services?
Thank you for the intervention. Yeah, I do agree with my honourable friend that we need to tighten up and look again at the criteria that Link are working to make sure banking hubs are in the right places. Coming away from banking hubs, I'd also like to raise the role of the post office, which is a vital service in many rural areas. In the village of Road, in my constituency, the post office sits within the local shop and cafe, doing vital work in not only posting parcels, but also supporting the local community. We have pop-up post offices at communities like Freshford and Mells. For the elderly, the post office is a vital support in providing information on how to deal with bills and understand their pension credits, as well as just generally having someone to talk to. Post office branches provide basic banking services, and in small towns where a bank hub isn't viable, post offices are often the only remaining financial institution for customers and SMEs.
Thank you very eloquently. good speech, and she's been very generous with her time already. I've been talking about the need for a banking hub in Holt, in the west of my constituency, which has unfortunately lost banking services, and local businesses tell me that the infrequent post office van that stops is simply not enough to regenerate the local economy. Been pleased to hear her speak about the need for banking hubs to represent slightly more loose criteria. Does she agree that for rural areas in particular, where central towns can be the linchpin of local economies, that we should really be looking at how we underpin the economic growth of those areas when we're looking at where we can bring in banking hubs?
Thank you for your intervention. I absolutely agree with the honourable member. In my constituency, cash deposits are valued at £2.1 million each month, which shows how reliant small businesses and charities are on having access to banking facilities that allow them to withdraw and deposit money. I would also like to talk about the issue of digital inclusion. In a world that's increasingly moving online, many elderly and vulnerable people are being left behind. Older people are not necessarily comfortable using online or even phone banking, and are being forced onto these services reduces their financial inclusion and puts them at greater risk of financial fraud. Rural communities can find themselves doubly excluded as more banking services move online, with a lack of access to cash facilities locally and poor digital connectivity.
Will the honourable member give way?
Yes, I will, yeah.
I'm grateful. One thing that residents have told me is that they really valued paper statements. Now, we've had 6,000 bank branches close in the last 9 years, and 2 of the new banking hubs are in the area I represent, in Axminster and Sidmouth. But people can't get hold of printed statements. Do they ought to be able to get that at banking hubs?
That's a great question from my honourable friend, and I believe they should do, but as I understand it, there's a challenge around banking hubs and printers because there's a data or GDPR issue around the different banks sharing the printer. So that's definitely something that needs to be looked into when we look at banking hubs. So going back to poor digital connectivity, just this week I've had an email from a couple in their 70s who run a small artisan business in Pilton. They're only getting speeds of around 1.5 to 3 megabytes if they use a normal router. But when they asked to be connected to the nearby Glastonbury Exchange, they were told this would cost them £290,000, including VAT. I've heard similar issues from farmers in my constituency who cannot get broadband past the boundary of their farm, which can be several miles from the actual property. Financial inclusion and digital inclusion are critically linked. For those on low incomes, access to online banking can be costly, requiring a computer or mobile phone data. For people in rural areas, it's very tricky to manage finances online with limited access to broadband. I will, yes, quickly.
And congratulate her for securing this important debate. I also represent a rural constituency, and one of the big problems that we have is many of those older generation residents, they've lost their buses over the last 10 years. We've had thousands of bus routes lost, and right now I have a very situation where some of my oldest residents in a more rural area are facing the prospect of losing the 145 bus, which is their only connection to the banks that are left in the constituencies. And I would hope that you would agree with me that perhaps the government's recent example of extra funding will help us protect those routes and urge local councils to not risk our older residents being cut off from key banking institutions.
I agree that bus routes are absolutely critical to rural communities. It would have been lovely if we could have kept the bus fare cap at £2, which has made it a little bit harder. But yes, I totally agree on buses and their importance in those areas. I'm going to make some progress now, if that's okay. I urge the government to think carefully about how they move forward with legislation on digital services for banking, especially in rural areas. Finally, while not necessarily a rural issue, I would like to make the Minister aware of a specific issue around the ID requirements for a bank account. I was visiting my local food bank in Frome on Monday, and they told me that while the government has a website designed to help those without an address to get the ID they need to open a bank account, there's a critical flaw in the process. The last stage of the website requires the applicant to get a professional, like an accountant or lawyer, who is personally known to them to sign off on their application. And clearly, for many of those applying, this isn't possible. Please could the Minister look at this, as it's currently preventing many people from accessing the ID they need to get a bank account. I'm pleased that the government's plans talk about financial inclusion, but the Lib Dems want to go further and see a dedicated national financial inclusion strategy. This would require the FCA to have regard to financial inclusion, such as protecting access to cash, especially in remote areas, supporting banking hubs, expanding access to bank accounts, and supporting vulnerable customers. As technology and innovation evolves, it's critical we bring everyone along on this journey, and this is very much the case when it comes to our finances. Rural areas deserve the same levels of financial access as everyone else, and I would urge the government to bear this in mind in their decision-making. Thank you very much.
Is that this House has considered financial inclusion in rural areas. Minister.
Thank you very much, And can I congratulate the Honourable Lady for securing her first Westminster Hall debate on such an important topic. And it's always, I sort of always say when we have debates like this, they're very conversational, and it's always nice when lots of people agree on the same thing. And the heartening thing is lots of people are intervening and everybody agrees. So thank you so much for drawing attention to these important issues that really matter to the lives of all of our constituents, because ensuring that individuals have access to the appropriate financial services and products when they need them is, of course, a key priority for this government. It's an essential part of improving household financial well-being and ensuring that everyone is able to participate in the economy and benefit from the government's inclusive growth agenda. Now, I recognise that tackling financial inclusion issues is particularly important for residents living in rural areas who can face specific geographical challenges in accessing financial services. And we've had some really good examples in the debate today of the particular challenges that people are facing. And, of course.
We tend to focus on this issue as people having access to cash principally. But in communities like mine, where we have a lot of cruise ships coming in the summer, tour guides are getting tipped in dollars and euros and other currency as well. For that, they need access to a bureau de change, which in our case is effectively the post office. And having that full range of post office services is particularly important for them actually just to be able to pay their money in. So when the Minister's talking to her colleagues in the Department for Business and Trade about the future of Crown Post offices, will she remember that there are a whole range of different ways in which this can impact on different local communities?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention. I think he's made a good pitch for getting a cruise ship to his constituency for a visit. I think that's a good advertisement. And I think it's an important point about the role and the importance of post office, and I'm sure it will be noted by the department. And I know that many rural constituencies are really concerned about availability of cash, especially when they rely on it to pay for essential goods and services. And I really want to take a moment to note how important we recognise this is for many vulnerable people. Because there's some arguments that some have made, not this government, that people are using digital more and more and therefore there is less access, there's less need for cash. But we absolutely recognise that for some people it is their only way of paying bills, it is their only way of funding. And this is why it's so important that we continue to have on it, and that many rely on it for essential goods and services. Now, while it's positive that data from the FCA shows that over 98% of people in rural areas are within 3 miles of free-to-use withdrawal facilities, I do understand the importance of ensuring that cash remains available for those who need it. And the Financial Conduct Authority introduced its regulatory rules to protect access to cash on the 18th of September. And in fact, in the previous government, I was on the Bill Committee on this very issue, debating it. So I'm very pleased that we have mandated access to cash. These rules require the UK's largest banks and building societies to assess the impact of the closure of a relevant cash access facility and put into place a new service if necessary. This ensures appropriate access to cash for those who need or choose to use it. Now, lots of people asked about banking hubs, and I should probably declare, just in case I don't later, I'm getting a banking hub in my own constituency soon, which is very, very exciting. So in looking at how do people get a banking hub in their constituency, which I completely agree again about face-to-face banking services, it's not just about going and accessing cash, and it's also has a wider role to play. And if you're going and accessing banking facilities, and it can be a way to spot financial crime, it can be a way to spot financial coercion as well. So I think it's really important we have that. Of course, the locations are independently determined by Link, the largest provider of the ATM network. And when a cash service such as a bank branch closes, or if Link receives a request directly from a community, Link assesses a community's access to cash needs. Now, a couple of people mentioned about how they weren't successful in their appeal for a banking hub. So if you've already made a community request to Link and they've decided no banking hub is needed, you can ask Link to review their decision within 28 days of the original assessment, stressing your concerns and evidence. There is an appeal process which I urge people to take advantage of. And the criteria that Link... Of course.
Can the Minister clarify whether or not Link is covered by the growth duty, requiring regulators to consider the economic consequences of their actions, because one point that's been made a couple of times today already is the impact of local growth of these closures on local businesses.
Well, absolutely. So Lincoln are covered by the Financial Conduct Authority, and of course the Financial Conduct Authority has a growth duty, a duty to promote growth. And just to give a bit more evidence, no worries, a bit more on the criteria that they use to base a decision is on whether or not there is bank branch remaining, the population size, the number of shops on the high street, the distance to the nearest bank branch, public transport links, and vulnerability of the population. So, as I say, I do urge members to appeal if they haven't got, if they found themselves unsuccessful the first time around. So moving on, alongside access to cash, I know that constituents are also concerned about challenges in accessing in-person banking. As highlighted in the debate today, this is particularly an issue for individuals living in rural areas where there is less close access to in-person services than in urban areas. Of course.
Thank you, Mr. Pritchard, and may I thank the Minister for giving way. Would you agree with me there's also an important point here about disabled and vulnerable people wanting to speak to another person, have advice and guidance from a qualified person who's representing banks so that they can help them with their banking? That seems to be something that my constituents are particularly concerned about. And it can also apply to small businesses, many of whom want to have the ability to engage with bank staff to discuss their own financial matters.
I completely agree with my honourable friend. It's absolutely important. And again, going back to the issue of vulnerability, it is a way that sometimes with in-person services you can identify financial coercion, which is always a huge concern. This is why the banking hubs are so important that the government are committed to rolling out. And this is, can I say, completely in character of my honourable friend to highlight the need to support vulnerable people in his constituency. But then this is exactly why my colleague, the Economic Secretary, is working closely with the industry to roll out 350 banking hubs across the UK, which will provide individuals who need face-to-face support with critical banking services. And I, as I say, personally, hugely supportive of the banking hubs. But we're taking further steps to ensure that individuals can access the financial services and products they need. Now, last week, and I was very excited about this, the government announced a financial inclusion strategy to further tackle the problems of financial inclusion. This strategy will be supported by a committee which my colleague, the Economic Secretary, convened for the first time last week. This committee brings together consumer groups and the financial sector to consider a range of barriers to inclusion for excluded groups, focusing on key policy areas such as access to banking, but also affordable credit, which is another huge problem for vulnerable people, and insurance. And it's clear that there are significant challenges that need addressing. A quarter of adults have less than £100 in savings. Over 1 million adults are unbanked. There is a reported £2 billion unmet need for credit, and over 8 million people are struggling with financial debt. So just to go into a little bit more detail, if time allows, on what the financial inclusion strategy includes, this committee is going to be working with consumer groups and industry to develop a strategy, considering a range of barriers. To tackle these long-term issues effectively, we need to listen to the voice of experts. That's why we've convened this group, who will be tasked with drawing on relevant expertise across the sector and lived experience. But we're also going to be listening to people on the ground, because this will require a joined-up approach across government, the financial services sector and frontline organisations. We're going to be engaging widely on this agenda to ensure the strategy considers a wide range of frontline perspectives. And this will be published next year, following extensive work by the Financial Inclusion Committee to consider the barriers to access and solutions to address them. It is important, of course, that we take the time to get this right and seek impact from those most affected by the issue of financial exclusion. So that's why this government has made it clear its commitment to going further in tackling this. And while this work is in early stages, I know that the Economic Secretary recognises the importance of this issue to our constituents and will keep the House updated as it progresses. So it just ends with me saying, Mr Chairman, thanks again to the Honourable Lady. It's been a pleasure to participate in her first debate. And thanks to everyone who's participated. I think there's a lot of support in this room for the need for banking services, the importance of face-to-face, the importance of access to cash, and the importance that everybody in our society has access to the financial services that they need, regardless of where they live.
The question is that this House has considered financial inclusion in rural areas. Many of that opinion say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. Have a good afternoon. We'll suspend the sitting for a few minutes till everybody's in place. Next debate shortly.